This is not a story about anger. It's about the silence that hides it, the smile that conceals the storm. Carl Jung once said that what we repress does not die. It waits. And when the waiting ends, it does not return as emotion. It returns as fate. If you've ever swallowed your rage to keep the peace, if you've ever smiled when your body screamed to speak, then what you're about to hear is not a warning. It's a mirror. Anger never disappears. It changes its name. It hides behind politeness, behind control, behind the slow poison of a smile too practiced to be real. Jung once wrote that what we repress does not vanish. It gathers mass in the darkness of the unconscious, condensing into something heavier, denser, and infinitely more dangerous. Repressed anger is not absence, it is potential energy. It waits quietly until the structure that imprisons it begins to crack. And when it escapes, it does not come as rage. It comes as illness, as accident, as despair. The story of hidden rage is the story of civilization itself. From childhood, we are taught that anger is a flaw, a shameful inheritance from something primitive. Be nice, calm down, don't raise your voice. The message is clear. Love is rewarded, anger is punished. So we swallow it. We compress fury into obedience and call it maturity. But every act of suppression leaves residue, emotional sediment that collects in the depths of the psyche. Jung saw this accumulation as the foundation of the shadow, the rejected half of the soul. The shadow, he said, is not evil, it is vitality denied, and anger is its heartbeat. To understand how repressed rage becomes destructive, we must look not at explosions, but at implosions. Outward violence is visible, inward violence is worshipped as self-control. The person who never yells, never complains, never breaks, appears saintly, but beneath the calm surface, something burns. The body becomes the battlefield where emotion seeks escape. Ulcers, migraines, chronic pain, each symptom a fragment of rage denied speech. Jung once wrote, "The gods have become diseases." What he meant is that our forbidden emotions, once honored as divine forces, now manifest as pathologies when we refuse to feel them. Imagine a woman named Elise. She is admired for her serenity. Her friends say she never gets angry. Her colleagues call her the peacemaker. But at night, her jaw aches from clenching. She wakes with her hands curled into fists. Small noises, a dripping tap, a careless word, send electricity through her nerves. She tells herself she's fine, but her body knows better. Jung would call this somatic revolt, the body expressing what the mind has silenced. Elise's peace is not harmony. It is suppression disguised as virtue. Neuroscience confirms this ancient insight. When anger is repressed, the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, remains active, signaling threat even when no danger is present. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for regulation, suppresses the expression of emotion but not its physiological charge. The result is a constant, invisible stress response. Elevated cortisol, increased heart rate, inflammation. Over time, this becomes the breeding ground for depression and autoimmune disease. The body becomes the unconscious made flesh. Jung understood this long before brain scans existed. He saw that repressed anger turns inward, becoming moral rigidity, cynicism, or guilt. If one does not express evil outwardly, he warned, it turns inward as self-destruction. The person who cannot bear their own aggression often becomes self-punishing, overworking, overgiving, apologizing for existing. The anger that might have set them free now keeps them chained. They confuse restraint with virtue and mistake numbness for peace. Culturally, this repression has become a religion. Western morality, built on ideals of self-control and decorum, treats anger as sin rather than signal. But ancient wisdom told a different story. In Greek myth, even the gods raged. Hera, Ares, Athena, each embodied aspects of divine fury. Anger was not condemned, it was consecrated. It was the fire that forged justice. Jung believed modern man's denial of this sacred rage was spiritual castration, the loss of instinct, of passion, of life itself. We became tame, he said, and our tameness is killing us. Hidden anger also shapes relationships. Lovers who never fight accumulate invisible resentments that eventually erupt as betrayal or silence. Families that don't talk about conflict rot under the weight of politeness. Jung described this as emotional incest, the fusion of people who refuse confrontation and instead devour each other's energy through guilt and expectation. What we refuse to express consciously, he said, we enact unconsciously. The couple that never argues may be the closest in distance, but the farthest in truth. The most terrifying aspect of repressed anger is its disguise. It doesn't always look like fury. Sometimes it looks like depression, anger turned inward. Sometimes it looks like anxiety, anger frozen in anticipation. Sometimes it looks like perfectionism, anger disciplined into control. Each symptom is a mask of the same archetype, the warrior exiled from consciousness. Jung saw this archetype as essential for psychological health. Without it, the psyche becomes defenseless. The person who rejects their inner warrior becomes a victim not of others, but of themselves. Consider the collective dimension. A society that represses anger breeds fanaticism. The forbidden emotion gathers in the unconscious of the masses, erupting as political extremism, moral outrage, or violence disguised as righteousness. Jung warned that when a people deny their aggression, it returns as ideology. The wars of nations begin in the censored hearts of individuals. Every revolution, every genocide, begins with the same phrase: I'm not angry, I am right. Yet anger, in its pure form, is not destruction. It is awareness of injustice. It is the psyche's alarm that something has been violated, a boundary, a value, a truth. When acknowledged consciously, anger becomes clarity. It burns through illusion and restores integrity. But when denied, it mutates into its opposite: manipulation, bitterness, cruelty. The person who represses rage does not lose it. They lose control of it. Jung called the integration of anger the reconciliation of opposites. To embrace our fury consciously is to reclaim vitality without violence. It means allowing the energy of aggression to serve rather than destroy. The sword, once wild, becomes tool. The fire, once consuming, becomes forge. The empath who feared conflict becomes the warrior who defends peace. Elise, the woman who could never be angry, eventually finds herself weeping in therapy. Not from sadness, but from rage finally spoken. She remembers every injustice she swallowed, every apology she gave for things that weren't her fault. The tears burned and then cleanse. For the first time in decades, her breath deepens, her pulse steadies. Jung would say the God has been released. The hidden rage, once brought to light, does not destroy the person. It resurrects them, because beneath every suppressed scream lies the truth of the self, raw, fierce, alive. No one is born afraid of their anger. A newborn's scream is pure life, sound made flesh, unfiltered expression of need and existence. But somewhere between the cradle and adulthood, the primal cry becomes forbidden. We are taught to smile when we want to snarl, to say I'm fine when our chest burns. By the time we can spell the word anger, we've already learned that it's dangerous. Jung understood this as one of the earliest fractures in the human psyche, the split between the instinctual self and the social self, the beginning of repression. It begins in the smallest moments. A child throws a toy in frustration. A parent scolds them instead of teaching them what they feel. Stop that. Don't be angry. You're being bad. The child learns the first false equation: anger decrypts rejection. Soon, their nervous system rewires around that truth. Each time anger rises, it collides with fear of losing love. The brain merges two incompatible states, aggression and attachment, into one: paralysis. The child suppresses the flame to protect the bond. Jung would say the archetype of the child has been forced to betray its own instinct in exchange for belonging. This is the first trauma of civilization. The tribe demands control, the family demands obedience, and the soul pays the price. Studies in developmental psychology confirm what Jung intuited symbolically. Children punished for expressing anger show long-term activation of the amygdala and underdevelopment of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for emotional integration. They grow up with hypervigilant nervous systems that interpret assertion as danger. What looks like calmness is often dissociation, the freeze response masquerading as peace. The child then learns the art of substitution. Anger becomes sadness, frustration becomes apology, pain becomes humor. They adapt to maintain safety, inventing strategies that look like empathy, but are really avoidance. Jung called this the birth of the persona, the mask that protects the psyche from rejection. But every mask conceals something alive underneath. The repressed anger doesn't vanish. It retreats into the shadow, waiting for the adult self to rediscover it. There is a story Jung told about a patient who could never say no. Her childhood had been ruled by a father who demanded silence and a mother who rewarded compliance. When asked what she felt toward them, she smiled and said, "I love them very much." Jung noticed her hands trembled as she spoke. He said softly, "Then why do your hands disagree with your mouth?" In that moment, she began to weep. The body had been speaking the truth all along. Her trembling was her soul's language, the ancient dialect of repressed fire. Modern trauma therapy now understands this phenomenon. The autonomic nervous system, particularly the vagus nerve, records unexpressed fight responses. When a child is punished for anger, their body learns to inhibit the physiological impulse to act, to tense without release. Over time, this creates chronic muscular armor, clenched jaws, tight shoulders, shallow breath. The body becomes the vault where rage sleeps. Jung might have said the gods of war have taken refuge in the flesh. The tragedy is that the child's anger was never evil. It was communication. It said, something hurts, something is unfair, something must change. But adults, uncomfortable with their own unintegrated rage, mistake that cry for defiance. They suppress it in their children as it was once suppressed in them. Thus, the lineage of repression continues. Families become emotional monasteries where silence is holiness and anger is sin. Generations forget that assertiveness is not violence and that boundaries are not betrayal. Culturally, we reinforce this conditioning with gender. Boys are told their anger is strength until it scares others. Girls are told their anger is unbecoming until they use it to survive. Both inherit confusion. The male learns to externalize rage as domination, the female to internalize it as guilt. Jung wrote that where love is forced, hatred will grow underground. Or our cultural scripts have buried entire continents of resentment beneath the facade of harmony. This internal division gives birth to the anxious adult who cannot say no, who apologizes for existing, who pleases everyone but themselves. They enter relationships that mirror their childhood. Partners who withdraw love when they assert themselves. They stay small to stay safe. But safety bought with silence is not safety. It is self-erasure. Jung would call this the neurotic sacrifice of the instinctual life. The person becomes civilized but soulless, yet the unconscious never forgets. The repressed energy begins to seep through cracks. Sarcasm, passive aggression, chronic fatigue, psychosomatic pain, anger disguised as kindness, cruelty disguised as compassion. Jung called this enantiodromia, the law that everything, when pushed to its extreme, becomes its opposite. The overly gentle person eventually becomes cruel in ways they cannot admit. The caretaker becomes tyrant. The saint becomes sinner. Hidden fire finds expression through the only channels left. Neuroscientific research adds a modern mirror. Repression of anger increases limbic hyperactivity and reduces the brain's capacity for empathy. Those who suppress rage too deeply often swing between numbness and sudden emotional storms. The circuitry of emotion, deprived of healthy release, mutates into volatility. Jung's archetypal insight lives in fMRI images. The denied instinct always returns, either as symptom or as fate. And yet, within this inherited repression lies a strange grace. The anger we fear holds the map to our authenticity. When we trace it back to its source, we find the places where love was conditional, where safety required silence. Jung wrote that the shadow is 90% pure gold. The task is not to kill the dragon of anger, but to befriend it, to listen to its flame until it teaches discernment. The first time an adult survivor of suppression allows themselves to feel anger without acting on it, a quiet miracle occurs. The energy that once terrified them now feels clean, alive. It no longer demands destruction, it demands truth. The child within, long muted, finally speaks. And in that moment, the fire ceases to be weapon. It becomes warmth. The origin of suppression was not evil parenting or flawed culture. It was fear, the universal terror of being unloved for being real. The work now is not vengeance, but reclamation. To tell the inner child, your fire is not danger, it is life itself. Jung would say that in that moment, the archetype completes its circle. The once frightened child becomes the conscious adult who can hold both love and rage without splitting into fragments. The fire that once burned them now lights the path home. There's a kind of kindness that smells faintly of smoke. It looks soft, generous, composed, but beneath the calm surface there is something smoldering. Jung called this the moral disguise of the shadow. When the psyche, terrified of its own rage, transforms aggression into virtue, the person who cannot allow themselves to be angry begins to perform goodness as a shield, but repressed emotion never disappears. It finds another form. It leaks through smiles, through exhaustion, through the brittle perfection of the good person who quietly resents everyone they save. The mask of virtue begins as survival. A child learns that love depends on pleasing. They discover that politeness calms danger, that niceness buys safety, so they build their identity around being kind, patient, forgiving. As adults, this becomes their armor. They apologize first, forgive fastest, absorb every insult and call it strength. But inside, their body remembers the cost. Jung wrote that what you resist persists. Every time anger is swallowed, it settles deeper, hardening into resentment disguised as serenity. The mask thickens. The face beneath grows pale. Modern psychology calls this toxic positivity, the compulsive insistence on goodness, even when it suffocates truth. Neuroscience has a more clinical term, emotional suppression with counterfeited regulation. It means that the outward calm of the good person is achieved not through integration, but through denial. Their prefrontal cortex suppresses limbic activity, keeping rage buried, but the autonomic nervous system still pays the price. Studies show chronic niceness correlates with elevated inflammation and fatigue. The saintly smile often hides a body burning from within. Jung saw this phenomenon most clearly in what he called persona inflation, the moment when the social mask becomes more real than the self. He warned that those who identify too fully with virtue become possessed by it. The brighter the persona, he wrote, the darker the shadow. The person addicted to being good loses contact with authenticity. They mistake the approval of others for moral worth, and in doing so, they feed the unconscious monster they claim to have slain. Their hidden anger turns inward first, self-criticism, guilt, perfectionism, and outward later as quiet sabotage and passive cruelty. The most dangerous kindness is the kind that cannot say no. Jung described it as the serpent wrapped in a smile. It is not malicious, but it is manipulative. When goodness becomes compulsive, it demands repayment. The person who overgives begins to expect gratitude, loyalty, reverence. When it doesn't come, their repressed fury emerges in disguised form: sarcasm, cold withdrawal, martyrdom. The good one becomes the silent accuser. After everything I've done for you, it is vengeance disguised as disappointment. There's a story from Jung's notes of a man admired by everyone for his composure. He never lost his temper, never argued, never judged. But his dreams told another story: violent storms, burning houses, murdered children. Jung interpreted the dreams not as prophecy, but as compensation. The unconscious screaming what consciousness refused to feel. The man's politeness was not peace, it was paralysis. He lived, Jung wrote, as though standing on a volcano pretending it was marble. This is how repressed anger corrupts morality. When the drive for virtue becomes absolute, it turns into its opposite. The person becomes rigid, judgmental, controlling. Jung compared it to the medieval ascetics, who mutilated their bodies in the name of purity, violence turned inward masquerading as holiness. Today, we see it in moral perfectionism, in the social crusader who cannot tolerate dissent, in the empath who condemns anger in others while secretly drowning in it. The unintegrated shadow of rage does not vanish. It simply finds a more socially acceptable uniform. Science, too, recognizes this duality. Studies on agreeableness and repression show that chronic compliance predicts higher rates of chronic illness and depression. People who suppress anger to maintain harmony report lower life satisfaction and increased cardiovascular risk. Their constant self-silencing triggers the same stress responses as trauma. The mask of virtue is biologically unsustainable. It asks the body to lie every day. Ancient philosophy also warned against this counterfeit goodness. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu wrote, "When goodness is lost, morality appears." True virtue, he said, does not need to announce itself. The more we force it, the further we drift from it. Jung echoed this sentiment. There is no morality without consciousness. To be truly good is to be aware of one's capacity for evil and to choose otherwise. The one who denies their rage entirely does not become holy. They become hypocritical. Imagine Anna, a teacher adored by her students, known for her patience. She never raises her voice, never punishes harshly. Yet every evening she drinks until her hands shake. She tells herself it's just to relax, but deep down she knows it's the only time her anger can breathe. Her liver becomes the altar where her hidden rage is sacrificed daily. When she finally collapses into therapy, her words are soft, but venomous. I hate everyone who needs me. Jung would call this the confession of the false saint, the moment when shadow demands truth over virtue. The awakening from this mask is brutal but liberating. When the good person finally allows themselves to feel anger, they often weep, not from guilt, but from relief. They realize that their rage was never evil, it was their soul fighting for air. Jung believed that integrating anger restores authenticity. To confront a person with their own shadow, he said, is to show them their light. The mask cracks, and beneath the plaster of perfection, life returns. But shedding the mask of virtue requires courage. The world will punish those who no longer perform its moral theater. The person who once soothed others now disturbs them. Their honesty feels abrasive to those addicted to comfort. Yet this rejection is proof of transformation. The newly authentic individual no longer belongs to the cult of niceness. They belong to reality. In time, their anger refines itself into discernment. It stops reacting and starts revealing. They learn to say no without apology, to disagree without hate, to express truth without violence. The same fire that once threatened to burn the world now fuels clarity. Jung would call this ethical wholeness, the integration of virtue and instinct. When the mask of virtue finally falls, what remains is not cruelty but honesty, not rebellion but balance. The repressed fire becomes a lantern, steady, warm, impossible to counterfeit, because true goodness does not fear its shadow. It walks beside it. The unconscious does not write letters. It speaks through the flesh. When anger is denied long enough, it finds a new language: muscle tension, migraines, insomnia, addiction. The body becomes the stage where the unspoken drama of rage is performed night after. Jung warned that what you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as fate. He might have added, and what you refuse to feel will eventually be felt by your body. For centuries, we've treated the mind as a separate kingdom from the flesh. We say, "I'm fine," while our stomach twists. "I forgive you," while our pulse races. But the body does not believe in repression. It records everything. Each time anger rises and is swallowed, the nervous system registers unfinished movement. The fight impulse interrupted. The energy doesn't disappear, it freezes. Muscles contract, the diaphragm locks, the breath shortens. Jung saw this frozen vitality as the physical counterpart of the shadow, the living part of us imprisoned by civility. Modern neuroscience now verifies what Jung observed in dreams and symbols. When emotion is suppressed, the limbic system remains active while the cortex silences expression. The result is internal war, adrenaline without release. Over time, this war carves itself into tissue. Chronic anger repression is linked to hypertension, autoimmune disease, and even cancer. Dr. Gabor Mate calls it the disease of pleasing, the body's rebellion against emotional dishonesty. Jung would have said it differently. The gods of destruction once denied begin their feast inside the soul. Consider the story of Mark, a man in his 40s who never shouts, never argues, never cries. He calls himself peaceful, but his peace costs him sleep, intimacy, vitality. One morning he collapses at work, a heart attack. No blockage, no genetic issue. His cardiologist calls it stress. But the truth is older. Every "I'm fine" was a brick in a wall around his heart. Decades of compressed rage finally broke the structure meant to contain it. Jung would call this psychic compensation, the body completing what the psyche refused to finish. The ancient world understood this better than we do. In Greek medicine, anger was associated with bile, literally the body's fire. To repress it was to poison oneself. In Chinese philosophy, unexpressed anger stagnates the liver's energy, leading to heat rising, headaches, irritability, and illness. Even the Bible whispers the same truth. Be angry and do not sin. Not never be angry but consciously. Across cultures, wisdom agreed. To exile rage is to invite decay. The body becomes a confessional for those who will not speak. The clenched jaw says what words could not. The ulcer repeats every argument swallowed whole. The shoulders carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken no's. When the mind refuses to express, the organs protest. Jung's patients often reported inexplicable pain. He did not dismiss it as psychosomatic illusion. He saw it as the shadow's handwriting. The soul, he wrote, demands incarnation. If we refuse to live our truth outwardly, it will live itself inwardly. Addiction is another form of this incarnation. Repressed anger is pure energy seeking outlet. When expression is forbidden, the psyche turns to substitutes. Alcohol, food, work, sex, scrolling, shopping. Anything that mimics the feeling of release. Neuroscience reveals that anger and addiction share the same dopaminergic pathways. Both promise relief, both conceal despair. The addict is often a pacifist in disguise, someone who learned early that direct expression was dangerous, so they anesthetize the storm instead. Jung saw addiction not as moral failure, but as the search for the lost God. The drink, the drug, the compulsion, each is a counterfeit ritual, an unconscious attempt to release the energy of suppressed emotion. Trauma research paints the same picture. When anger is blocked, the vagus nerve, the body's bridge between emotion and physiology, becomes dysregulated. The person lives in permanent fight or flight mode without fighting or fleeing. The result is exhaustion, brain fog, digestive distress. Dr. Peter Levine calls it the thwarted fight response. Jung called it possession by the shadow. Two languages, one truth. Energy denied becomes energy that dominates. Even fate itself seems to conspire in this process. The person who never expresses anger often attracts those who will express it for them. Jung noted that our outer life mirrors our inner imbalance. The passive draw the aggressive. The compliant marry the cruel. Until you make the unconscious conscious, he said, it will direct your life, and you will call it destiny. Repressed rage becomes the hidden author of relationships, careers, and tragedies. Life organizes itself to expose what we refuse to face. But this cycle is not punishment. It is invitation. Every illness, every addiction, every accident is the psyche's last attempt to speak. Jung urged his patients to ask not, why is this happening to me, but what in me seeks expression through this? The body's rebellion is not betrayal. It is communication. The fever, the panic attack, the relapse, these are not failures of willpower, but signals from the buried self, the part that still remembers how to feel. Healing begins when anger is reclaimed as sacred energy. This does not mean exploding or hurting others. It means allowing the fire to move without burning. Breath work, movement, expression, not to release violence, but to reconnect with vitality. Jung wrote that emotion is the chief source of consciousness. There is no transformation of darkness into light without emotion. The body must become the alchemical furnace where repression turns to realization. As this process unfolds, symptoms often shift. The migraines ease, the fatigue lifts, the addictions lose their grip. It is not miracle. It is integration. The energy that once screamed through the body has finally been given language. The gods are fed. The war is over. Mark, the man who collapsed from his own restraint, begins therapy. For months he struggles to feel anything. Then, one day, in a session, he clenches his fists, pounds the floor, and shouts a single phrase. I am angry. The words echo through the room like thunder. He weeps afterward, not from sorrow, but from release. His blood pressure drops, his chest loosens, his laughter returns. The body, long his enemy, becomes his ally again. This is the truth the modern world forgets. The body is not a machine. It is a messenger. When it breaks, it is not punishing you. It is trying to free you. Jung would call this the moment when the instinct and the spirit reunite, when the soul descends fully into flesh. The body no longer carries the unconscious. It becomes conscious. The once hidden rage, no longer corrosive, transforms into strength. And from that strength arises something rarer than peace, wholeness. Because the body never forgets. But when listened to, it forgives. Every act of repression echoes. What one generation buries in silence, the next inhales like smoke. Jung warned that the family is not just a collection of individuals, but a psychic organism, a web of emotions, myths, and unspoken oaths. In its shadows, unfinished feelings circulate like inherited blood. Among them, none burns longer than unexpressed anger. It is passed down not in stories, but in gestures, in tone, in the nervous tremor of someone who flinches before conflict and cannot explain why. When we inherit unresolved rage, we mistake it for temperament. We say, "I'm just anxious like my mother," or "I have my father's temper," never realizing that what we call personality may be the residue of another's war. Jung described this phenomenon as the ancestral complex, psychic patterns that repeat across generations until consciousness interrupts them. The child who grows up amid suppressed fury becomes its next vessel. They absorb tension through the air, through glances, through the coded language of politeness that hides resentment beneath duty. Science now confirms what Jung observed through dreams and myths. Epigenetic research shows that trauma, particularly from violence and repression, alters gene expression, affecting stress hormones and emotional regulation in descendants. The body literally remembers what the ancestors refused to feel. A grandmother's silence during an abusive marriage can leave her granddaughter hypervigilant, flinching at raised voices she's never personally endured. This is not superstition. It is biology writing myth into DNA. The shadow is hereditary. In one of Jung's case studies, a patient named Clara suffered panic attacks whenever she heard a man shout. She had never been assaulted, never even argued loudly, yet her terror was absolute. Through analysis, Jung traced the pattern to her grandfather, a soldier whose rage at his own father's death was never expressed. Instead, he drank himself into quiet self-destruction. That buried fury became the family's ghost, whispering through generations, looking for a throat to scream through. Clara's panic was the echo of a century-old cry. Families built on repressed anger often appear functional on the surface, disciplined, proper, respected, but their order is maintained by fear, not harmony. Conversations stay shallow. Disagreement is taboo. Children learn that love means obedience and that truth is dangerous. They become experts at reading emotional weather, predicting storms before they arrive. This hyper-awareness feels like empathy, but is actually survival. Jung called it the sensitivity of the haunted. These children grow into adults who can sense everyone's feelings except their own. In mythic terms, ancestral rage is the dragon guarding the family treasure, the repressed truth. Each generation must face it or live under its curse. Those who avoid it call their avoidance peace. Those who confront it risk being labeled the problem. Jung noted that the one who brings consciousness to a family shadow is always crucified for it. The black sheep, the rebel, the one accused of being too emotional, they are often the unwitting healers, carrying centuries of unspoken fury into the light. Modern psychology calls this intergenerational transmission of trauma, but Jung would call it karma, not as punishment, but as psychic gravity. The unbalanced emotion seeks resolution through time. The child born into a lineage of repression carries both the wound and the remedy. Their own anger, once feared, becomes the key to ancestral release. When they finally scream, they are not only speaking for themselves, but for all those who could not. The collective nature of this fire extends beyond bloodlines. Entire nations inherit suppressed rage. Cultures built on colonization, war, or oppression often manifest the same psychic split as the individual, outward civility masking inward violence. Jung witnessed this in pre-war Europe and wrote, "The state has become the modern substitute for the unconscious." He saw in the rise of fanaticism the eruption of collective anger denied for centuries. The repressed instinct of the tribe returns as ideology, as war, as fate. And yet, in each family and culture, the pattern can be interrupted. It requires one consciousness brave enough to stop inheriting silence. Healing begins the moment someone refuses to normalize dysfunction. The act of saying no more is alchemical. It transforms victimhood into awareness. Jung called this the return of the fire to its source. The repressed energy, once owned, becomes creative force. The anger that destroyed generations becomes the fuel for transformation. Imagine a man named Raphael who grows up in a house where his father never speaks and his mother cries quietly in the kitchen. As a child, he decides never to upset anyone. As an adult, he becomes a counselor, gentle, patient, always listening. But in his 40s, he begins to suffer nightmares, dreams of a burning house, screams behind walls. In therapy, he learns that his grandfather beat his grandmother, that his father's silence was terror disguised as control. One evening, while recounting the story, Raphael's voice breaks. He strikes the table with his fist. a sound that startles even him. The therapist says, "That wasn't anger at your father. That was the anger of every man in your family finally finding a voice." Jung would have seen this as the ancestral shadow completing its arc. The fire, once repressed, has burned through the lineage and found consciousness. The dragon, faced without fear, reveals not destruction but treasure. Vitality, integrity, will. Rituals help bridge the psychic and the physical. Writing letters to ancestors, naming their pain aloud, lighting candles for the unspoken. These acts are not superstition. They are symbolic communication with the unconscious. Jung viewed ritual as dialogue between the ego and the archetype, between the living and the timeless. When a descendant honors the anger of those who came before, the energy stops demanding attention through illness or repetition. The dead, finally acknowledged, rest. Even modern neuroscience acknowledges the healing of narrative. Studies show that naming family trauma reorganizes neural pathways, reducing amygdala hyperactivation and promoting integration. To speak the unspeakable literally rewires the brain. What myth calls redemption, science calls regulation. Every family carries a myth of silence. Every lineage has a forbidden emotion. For some, it is grief. For many, it is rage. The work of consciousness is not to condemn the ancestors, but to complete them. Jung said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. To live that unlived fire consciously is to free both past and future. And when we do, something extraordinary happens. The air in the family shifts, conversations deepen, laughter sounds less defensive, the nightmares stop, the children grow without the reflex of fear, the dragon lies down. The treasure, the capacity for authentic emotion, returns to the bloodline. The ancestral fire does not die. It transmutes from curse into compass, from wound into wisdom. And in that transformation, the dead finally exhale, whispering through the silence. At last, you burned for us. When the fire cannot find its voice, it learns to hide inside control. Jung warned that energy denied never disappears. It reorganizes. And repressed anger, once stripped of its name, dresses itself in new forms. Perfectionism, domination, emotional manipulation, cold superiority. It becomes moral. It becomes rational. It becomes help. But the truth is older and simpler. The person who fears their own rage tries to control the world to avoid feeling it. Control is rage domesticated. It is the nervous system's last attempt at safety. Those who cannot express anger outwardly begin to police everything inwardly. Thoughts, emotions, even breath. They develop rituals of order. Cleaning, planning, fixing, managing. On the surface, it looks like discipline. Underneath, it's panic. Jung described this as the ascetic's revenge against chaos. By denying instinct, they become possessed by it in its inverted form. The controller is not a villain. They are terrified. Every rule they impose, every boundary they over-enforce, is an unconscious prayer. Keep me from exploding. Having learned that anger destroys love, they now believe only control can preserve it. Yet the more they control, the more they suffocate intimacy. Love becomes a performance of safety rather than a meeting of souls. Jung saw this dynamic often in those who had repressed their aggression so deeply that they could only express it through moral superiority. The one who must be right, he wrote, is at war with the chaos within. Neuroscience confirms this war. Chronic emotional suppression activates the brain's error detection circuits, the anterior cingulate cortex, creating a constant sense of wrongness. The person lives in perpetual low-level alarm. To soothe it, they tighten their grip on relationships, on routines, on themselves. But what looks like control is the body's fight response frozen mid-motion. They are still trying to fight, only now through order instead of expression. The shadow of control manifests in two archetypes, the perfectionist and the manipulator. The perfectionist wields order like a weapon. They chase flawlessness in themselves and others, projecting their repressed aggression into criticism and judgment. Each flaw they correct in the world is an unacknowledged wound inside. The manipulator, on the other hand, controls through emotion, guilt, pity, charm. They learned early that direct anger brings punishment, so they weaponize vulnerability instead. Jung recognized both as distortions of the warrior archetype. One turned tyrant, the other strategist. Both are haunted by unexpressed fire. Consider Helena, a therapist admired for her calm authority. Her clients adore her. Her colleagues praise her professionalism. But at home, she feels nothing. Her partner complains that she's cold, unreachable. She doesn't yell, she withdraws. Each evening, she cleans the house obsessively, rearranging objects until the anxiety subsides. In session one day, a client accuses her of being detached. She smiles, but her hands shake. That night, she dreams of a lion pacing behind glass, teeth bared but silent. Jung would call it a message from the unconscious, the repressed instinct demanding release. Her control is the cage, her composure, the lock. The shadow of control can infect entire systems. Corporations that idolize productivity often mask collective aggression. The sterile calm of bureaucracy, the obsession with metrics, the constant professionalism, these are not order but sublimated violence. The language of efficiency hides a primal fear of chaos. Jung saw the same mechanism in totalitarian regimes, the state projecting its repressed aggression into surveillance, law, and punishment. Control is always the mask of terror. Ancient myths knew this truth. The story of King Midas warns that mastery without emotion turns life to stone. The tale of Kronos, who devoured his children, symbolizes the devouring father archetype, authority afraid of its own weakness. Jung wrote that modern man repeats these myths unconsciously. Every time we dominate instead of feel, we reenact the god's neurosis. Control as compensation for fear. Physiologically, the cost is immense. The body of the controller is rigid. Their jaw clenched, their gut tight, their breath shallow. Their cortisol never drops because vigilance never stops. They sleep lightly, dream of disasters, wake tired but driven. Studies show that chronic self-control correlates with immune dysfunction and shortened lifespan. The more we suppress aggression, the more we turn it inward, cell by cell. The organism, designed to pulse with energy, calcifies into tension. Eventually, control collapses. It has to. Jung described the breaking point as enantiodromia, the reversal of extremes. The hyper-controlled person snaps an affair, an outburst, a breakdown. The pendulum swings toward chaos, and for the first time, the repressed anger speaks without disguise. This is not failure, it is equilibrium returning. The lion finally roars, the glass finally shatters. What was imprisoned returns as power. Helena, after months of fatigue and migraines, finally allows herself to rage. In therapy, she screams until her voice cracks, then sobs in silence. The release feels sacrilegious, obscene, but afterward her chest loosens. She dreams again of the lion, this time walking freely through an open field. Jung would call this integration of the instinct, when control transforms from defense into conscious choice. In relationships, this transformation changes everything. The manipulator becomes honest. The perfectionist becomes compassionate. Control, stripped of fear, becomes clarity. The person learns that boundaries are not prisons. They are spaces where emotion can breathe without harm. Anger, once exiled, becomes discernment. It tells them where truth ends and illusion begins. At the collective level, this shift is revolution. A society that integrates anger no longer needs authoritarianism or moral crusades. Justice becomes restoration, not revenge. Leadership becomes guidance, not domination. Jung foresaw this possibility. A culture governed not by repression, but by self-awareness. Only the conscious man can act morally, he wrote. The unconscious man can only obey. The shadow of control dissolves when we understand its root, fear of the uncontrollable within. To master anger is not to cage it, but to listen. The energy that once built walls can build bridges. The same fire that forged chains can forge truth. Because control is only the ghost of safety. And the moment we face the storm inside, we realize the walls were never protecting us. They were keeping us from living. When the lion walks free, it does not devour. It watches. It protects. It roars only when needed. That is not danger. That is sovereignty. And sovereignty, Jung would say, is the soul's natural state once fear has burned away. Repression cannot hold forever. Beneath the calm facade, beneath the quiet politeness and the forced smiles, pressure accumulates like magma beneath stone. Jung said the unconscious always seeks equilibrium. What is denied above ground builds strength below it. When anger has been silenced long enough, it begins to dream of freedom. It becomes heat in the gut, tremor in the jaw, static in the mind. It seeps through cracks as sarcasm, as fatigue, as despair. But when the pressure exceeds containment, the eruption comes. Sometimes in words, sometimes in acts, sometimes in breakdowns that look like madness, but are actually truth emerging in its rawest form. The eruption is not chaos, it is compensation. The psyche, like the earth, corrects imbalance through force. Jung described such moments as the eruption of the unconscious, when buried energies return to consciousness violently because they were refused gently. The explosion might appear sudden, but it is centuries in the making. Childhood silences, inherited submission, cultural shame. The person who never raised their voice suddenly shouts. The caretaker walks away. The obedient one vanishes into solitude. To outsiders, it seems betrayal. To the soul, it is resurrection. The eruption takes many forms. For some, it is emotional. Screaming, weeping, words that pour like lava long held back. For others, it is physical. Illness, accident, collapse. The body forces the release the psyche could not allow. Jung saw this in countless patients who fell ill at the peak of self-control. He did not call it punishment, but initiation. The breakdown, he wrote, is the way through which the gods make themselves known. In mythic language, this is the wrath of the repressed god within, not cruelty, but demand for recognition. Neuroscience maps this eruption in the body. When anger is finally allowed expression, Adrenaline floods the bloodstream, the prefrontal cortex temporarily deactivates, and the limbic system takes command. This is why eruptions feel irrational. The ancient brain reclaims the stage. Yet beneath the chaos is order. The nervous system is discharging energy stored for years, completing the fight response frozen in childhood. What looks like rage is the body finally remembering movement. Imagine Lucas, a quiet man who has spent decades avoiding conflict. He is the one who mediates, forgives, apologizes first. Then one morning, in traffic, someone cuts him off and something snaps. He gets out of the car, shouting, trembling, tears mixing with fury. People record him, laugh, call him crazy. But for Lucas, it feels like awakening. He isn't angry at the driver. He's angry at every moment he silenced himself, every humiliation endured without protest. The eruption looks like madness because society has forgotten what honest emotion sounds like. Jung would say Lucas has met his shadow in daylight. The eruption terrifies those who witness it because it reveals the instability of repression itself. We build cultures on the illusion of control, civility, manners, order. But the eruption reminds us that the unconscious always wins. Jung compared this to volcanic gods of antiquity, entities of creation and destruction. Their eruptions birthed new lands even as they obliterated the old. The same is true for the psyche. After an eruption, the old identity lies in ruins, but the air is finally breathable. At the collective level, these eruptions shape history. Revolutions, protests, social collapses. They are the collective version of the same process. Jung wrote that when enough individuals repress the same instinct, it will erupt in the collective. A nation that silences its anger breeds tyranny or revolt. We see it in the sudden violence of peaceful societies, in moral panics that devour themselves. Civilization itself lives between repression and explosion. The cure, Jung insisted, is not more control but consciousness. Modern trauma therapy echoes this truth. Peter Levine calls the release of repressed energy completing the loop. The body shakes, screams, cries, trembles, not as pathology but as restoration. The eruption is not breakdown, it is thawing. When the energy discharges, clarity follows. The person who feared their own anger discovers its innocence. Beneath the fury is grief, beneath the grief, vitality, yet the eruption can destroy as easily as it heals if met without awareness. Unintegrated, it becomes vengeance, addiction, violence. Jung warned that when the shadow emerges without the guidance of the self, it possesses rather than liberates. The task is not to stop the eruption, but to witness it, to remain conscious as the fire rises. The one who can stay present in that storm becomes transformed by it. Ancient myths tell this same story. In Hindu cosmology, Shiva's dance of destruction annihilates the world only to recreate it purified. In alchemy, this phase is called calcinatio, the burning away of impurities to reveal essence. Jung saw human anger as the same fire, destructive only when resisted, purifying when accepted. The eruption, if faced consciously, becomes sacred combustion, ego burning so the soul can breathe. In the aftermath of eruption, silence arrives. Not the fragile silence of suppression, but the deep quiet after truth has spoken. Lucas, after his outburst, sits in his car shaking. Then he laughs. Not joy, but relief. He feels alive. He goes home and, for the first time, tells his partner how he really feels. There is fear, but also freedom. The eruption has broken the dam between emotion and word. From that moment, his anger no longer hides. It communicates. At the collective level, this same silence follows revolutions. The pause before rebuilding, when a society realizes what has been unleashed cannot be undone, but can be understood. Jung said, this is where individuation truly begins, when destruction has cleared enough space for new consciousness. The eruption, then, is not the end of repression, but its fulfillment, the moment when everything denied becomes undeniable. It is terrifying because it reveals how alive we still are beneath the numbness. It strips away roles, identities, masks, and leaves only heat, breath, and heartbeat. And in that rawness, something ancient stirs, the instinct that was never evil, only silenced. The same fire that destroys also illuminates. The same rage that terrifies also tells the truth. Jung would say, the eruption is the psyche's way of remembering itself, because sometimes, before the soul can whisper, it must first scream. After the eruption, there is ash. The ego stands trembling before the ruin of its own defenses, unsure what has survived. The air smells of something ancient, smoke, metal, renewal. This is the moment Jung called the alchemical stage of transformation, when the raw fire of emotion begins to purify rather than consume. The energy that once sought destruction now seeks direction. Anger, finally seen without shame, reveals its true nature, not poison, but power. In alchemy, fire was both destroyer and catalyst. It burned away impurities to release the hidden essence of matter. Jung saw the same process within the psyche. Repressed rage, once brought into consciousness, becomes the heat that forges integrity. It forces the individual to define boundaries, to name truth, to act. Without it, we remain ghosts in our own lives, But the transformation is delicate. If we cling to rage, it burns. If we deny it, it festers. Only awareness can hold the flame without being devoured by it. The first step of this alchemy is recognition. To look at anger without judgment, to feel it fully, yet not obey it. Most people fear this, believing that to admit anger is to lose control. But Jung taught that the opposite is true. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. By acknowledging anger, we remove its mask of destiny. It ceases to act through us unconsciously and begins to serve us consciously. Neuroscience mirrors this ancient wisdom. When individuals consciously observe emotion, activity in the amygdala decreases and the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason, regains balance. This is not suppression, it is integration. The nervous system learns that feeling is not danger. In this state, the energy of anger becomes available for creation, not reaction. The alchemists called it rubedo, the reddening, the moment when fire unites with consciousness to form gold. To illustrate this, imagine Mara, a woman who spent years trapped in resentment. Her husband left her for another, and she buried her rage under spiritual platitudes. Forgiveness is freedom. Love is the answer. But her body rebelled. Fatigue, digestive pain, insomnia. One day during meditation, she allows the truth to rise. She screams, weeps, shakes. She admits she hates him, hates herself, hates the illusion of serenity she built. For the first time, she feels alive. Weeks later, she channels that same intensity into painting. Canvases, alive with red and black and movement. Her art sells, her health returns. The energy of destruction has become creation. Jung would say her anger has been sublimated, transformed into conscious expression. This process does not mean sanitizing emotion. True alchemy demands contact with the raw material, the prima materia. The more we polish or rationalize our feelings, the less transformative they become. Anger must be touched in its primitive form, heat in the belly, tightness in the chest, the desire to act. The work is to bring awareness to the fire without extinguishing it. Meditation, movement, ritual, these become crucibles for transformation. Each conscious breath is bellows feeding the flame of awakening. Across traditions, this mastery of anger was seen as the mark of wisdom. In Buddhism, wrathful deities symbolize enlightened anger, fierce compassion that destroys illusion without hatred. In Christianity, Christ overturning the tables of the money changers represents divine fury in service of truth. In Greek philosophy, Aristotle called righteous anger a virtue, orge dikaiosune, the energy that defends justice without revenge. Jung believed these symbols spoke to the same archetype, the warrior integrated with the sage. When these opposites unite, anger becomes moral courage. At the physiological level, something profound occurs during this union. Studies on emotional regulation show that when anger is expressed mindfully through voice, art, or movement, dopamine and serotonin levels rise, creating a sense of clarity and empowerment. This is not catharsis, but coherence, the nervous system harmonizing with truth. The person no longer fights themselves. Their anger becomes directional, precise, purposeful. The second stage of alchemy is transmutation. The fire turns inward, burning through false beliefs. They must love me. I must be perfect. I cannot disappoint. Each phrase becomes fuel for transformation. The psyche, once fractured by repression, realigns around authenticity. Jung described this as the uniting of opposites, instinct and consciousness, chaos and order, emotion and awareness. The self becomes whole. But the final stage is service. The integrated person learns to wield anger as a sacred tool. No longer repressed, no longer explosive, it becomes boundary, clarity, and compassion in motion. They can say no without hate, confront without cruelty, defend without destroying. Their presence itself becomes stabilizing. Jung wrote that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it appears outside as fate. The person who integrates anger transforms fate into choice. Mara, the painter, embodies this new balance. Her ex-husband visits years later, apologetic, seeking closure. The old Mara would have smiled, forgiven too quickly, buried her feelings again. The new Mara listens, calm, clear. She says, "I understand, but I do not trust you." The words are neither cruel nor kind. They are true. Her voice carries the power of someone who has met her own fire and survived it. That is the alchemy of anger, honesty that no longer trembles. At the collective level, this transformation holds promise. Societies that channel collective anger into awareness rather than violence birth progress. Civil rights, reform, revelation, each began as rage made conscious. When guided by wisdom, the fire of outrage illuminates rather than incinerates. Jung saw in this the potential for collective individuation, humanity learning to wield its instincts with awareness. The world will not change until we change ourselves, he said. And we cannot change ourselves until we meet what burns within us. Or, to transform anger is to become fire that sees. Not the wildfire of reaction, but the steady flame of discernment. It does not consume, it illuminates paths once hidden in shadow. The alchemist of emotion learns that every blaze leaves behind gold dust, insight, integrity, strength. When we reach this state, we no longer fear anger nor worship it. We bow to it as teacher. We realize that the soul's fire was never against us. It was for us, waiting to be seen, honored, integrated. And from the ashes of repression rises something luminous, a self that burns without smoke, that loves without subservience, that speaks without trembling. Jung would say the transformation is complete when the fire no longer seeks destruction but radiates understanding. Because true mastery is not extinguishing the flame, it is learning to walk inside it without being consumed. Once the fire has been purified through awareness, what remains is not rage, but intelligence. Jung called this instinct redeemed, the transformation of primitive energy into moral power. In this state, anger no longer seeks destruction. It serves as sentinel. It stands at the gate of the psyche, sword drawn, eyes clear, whispering a single word: enough. For centuries, spirituality has romanticized forgiveness, compassion, surrender, but it has forgotten the holiness of limits. To forgive without boundary is to betray the self. To love without discernment is to dissolve into the other. Anger, when conscious, restores equilibrium. It marks the perimeter between what nourishes and what devours. Jung believed that individuation, true psychological maturity, depends on this sacred delineation. Without opposites, he wrote, there is no energy. The yes must know its no. The sacred boundary is not a wall, it is a membrane. It allows love to enter but refuses intrusion. Its function is not to separate us from life, but to preserve the space where life can unfold authentically. In the unintegrated psyche, anger guards nothing. It either attacks or submits. But once owned, it becomes a quiet, steadfast presence, the guardian of integrity. Biologically, this corresponds to the nervous system's ability to differentiate safety from threat. And when anger is repressed, this mechanism malfunctions. The person perceives danger everywhere or nowhere. Integrated anger restores precision. The vagus nerve regulates properly. The heart rate stabilizes. The muscles relax until needed. Boundaries, at their most literal, are physiology and balance. The body knows where it ends and the world begins. Imagine Aiden, a lifelong caretaker. He says yes to every request, absorbs everyone's pain. His therapist asks him to say no once a day. At first, the word feels like violence. His chest tightens, guilt floods his body. But over weeks, something shifts. Each no feels less like rejection and more like oxygen. He begins to notice subtle signals in his body: tension when others cross his limits, calm when he honors them. For the first time, he feels the difference between compassion and compliance. Jung would call this the awakening of the warrior archetype, the restoration of rightful power. Anger, when balanced, is the language of truth. It arises not to punish, but to inform. This is not right. This does not align. This must stop. In a conscious person, it becomes directional intelligence, guiding them toward authenticity. Modern psychology calls this assertive energy, the ability to express needs without aggression. Jung would call it ethical instinct. In both, the same principle applies. The psyche defends its wholeness. Ancient traditions also honored this sacred function. In Hindu mythology, Kali, often misunderstood as a goddess of rage, is in truth a guardian of boundaries. Her dance annihilates illusion, not life. In Greek myth, Nemesis restores balance where hubris has overstepped. Even Christ's fury in the temple was not sin, but sacred protection. Jung saw these deities as personifications of archetypal anger, the divine aspect of defense. They remind us that creation depends on containment. The universe itself expands only because space resists collapse. At the psychological level, this boundary work is the final stage of healing from repression. The individual no longer fears conflict. They do not seek it either. They can listen without absorbing, love without losing, confront without hatred. Their relationships deepen, paradoxically, because their edges are clear. Jung noted that only the strong can be gentle. The person who owns their anger can finally afford tenderness. Society often mistakes this strength for selfishness. We are conditioned to admire self-sacrifice, to equate virtue with exhaustion, but the empath who never says no becomes a vessel of resentment. Their unspoken anger poisons intimacy, turning care into control. Conscious boundaries prevent this corrosion. They allow compassion to remain clean. On the collective level, the same principle applies. Nations without moral boundaries descend into tyranny or chaos. The health of a culture can be measured by how it expresses collective anger, through justice or through vengeance. Jung feared that when societies lose their capacity for conscious boundary, they fall prey to possession by ideology. When the individual fails to differentiate, he warned, the mass devours him. The sacred boundary, then, is civilization's immune system. But perhaps the most profound boundary is internal, the one that separates thought from feeling, reaction from awareness. When anger rises, the conscious person observes it as signal, not command. They can say, something in me seeks protection. This pause, this breath, is the difference between the animal and the awakened. Jung described it as the moment the self looks at the shadow and does not turn away. In that instant, instinct and consciousness become one. Aiden's transformation completes when his elderly mother, once manipulative in her helplessness, demands he cancel a trip to care for her. For the first time, he says calmly, "No, I can't." Her silence on the phone is heavy with shock, but he feels something else, peace. He does not tremble, does not justify. His heart beats steadily, the guilt never arrives. In that quiet, he realizes anger has changed form. It is no longer fire, it is foundation. Jung would have recognized this as the final transmutation of the instinct, the sacred boundary integrated into being. The psyche now holds the polarity of love and strength, compassion and defense without collapse. The self becomes its own temple, open yet inviolable. To live with such boundaries is not to isolate, but to honor life. It is to say, here I end, and here you begin, and to understand that the meeting point between those two edges is where consciousness itself ignites. Because anger, once feared as the enemy, was never trying to destroy us. It was guarding the door we kept leaving open. And when that door is finally closed with awareness, the soul no longer burns, it rests. Every journey through darkness ends not with applause, but with quiet. After the storm, after the eruption, after the years of wrestling with silence and shadow, there comes a stillness so complete that it feels almost alien. This is not repression returning, it is peace. Jung called it the union of opposites, the moment when the fire and the light become indistinguishable, when the instinct that once terrified the soul now serves it. Anger has finished its transformation. It is no longer reaction, no longer armor, no longer weapon. It is awareness itself, fierce, luminous, alive. At this stage, the individual no longer identifies with emotion. They embody consciousness that can hold all emotion. Anger arises, burns clean, and dissolves without residue. There is no story, no guilt, no justification. It is pure signal, the psyche's heartbeat. Jung described this state as the integration of the shadow into the self. The once fractured energy of rage now flows through the entire being as vitality. It is the same power that animates art, passion, defense, and truth. The difference is that it no longer needs a disguise. The person who has reached this point radiates a different presence. There's gravity in them, but no tension. People sense strength, not threat. They speak few words, but when they do, the words carry weight. Jung wrote that the individuated person moves among others as a whole among fragments. This wholeness is not superiority, it is coherence. Their nervous system, once a battlefield, has become a sanctuary. Imagine Claire, a woman who once feared her temper more than death. Years of therapy, silence, tears, and solitude have stripped her masks away. One evening, during a conversation with her sister, the one who always pushed her buttons, she feels anger rising. It blooms hot in her chest, but there is no panic. She doesn't suppress it, doesn't explode. She simply says, calm but unwavering, "That's not acceptable." The words are simple, but the air shifts. For the first time, her sister listens. No drama, no violence, just truth. In that moment, Claire understands, this is what mastery feels like. The fire speaks softly now. Neuroscience gives this state a name, emotional coherence. The limbic and cortical regions of the brain operate in synchrony, producing balance rather than conflict. The body's stress chemistry resets, immune and endocrine systems stabilize. What Jung intuited symbolically as wholeness, biology records as health. Integration is not mystical, it is measurable. The psyche and the soma finally agree, but the final integration is not only personal, it is transpersonal. Jung believed that when an individual integrates a fragment of the collective shadow, they contribute to humanity's evolution. The salvation of the world, he wrote, is found in the salvation of the individual's soul. Every human who transforms rage into awareness lightens the field around them. The unconscious of the species shifts slightly toward balance. Consciousness expands not through preaching or politics, but through presence. Ancient mystics foresaw this same principle. In alchemy, the final phase was rubedo, the reddening, the moment when spirit incarnates fully in matter, when light and blood are one. In Christian mysticism, it was resurrection. In Buddhism, enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. Jung saw all these as metaphors for the same event, the awakening of consciousness through confrontation with its own fire. The hero descends into the underworld, not to destroy the dragon, but to merge with it. When they return, they no longer carry a sword. They are the sword, cutting illusion wherever it appears. The integrated person does not become perfect. They still feel anger, grief, fear. But now, these emotions are companions, not captors. They move through like weather through open sky. There's no need to analyze or control. Awareness has become spacious enough to hold contradiction without collapsing. Jung described this as living the symbolic life, a way of being in which every experience, even pain, serves meaning. Claire, months after that conversation, begins teaching meditation to trauma survivors. She doesn't preach calm or forgiveness. She teaches presence, the art of feeling without drowning. Her students often cry in her sessions, not from sadness, but from recognition. In her stillness, they sense their own potential peace. Jung would say she has become an instrument of the self, life flowing through her without resistance. At the collective level, this stage mirrors what humanity must one day achieve. Our species is still in the early phases of its psychological evolution, oscillating between repression and eruption, between silence and violence, but each conscious human becomes a cell in the emerging global mind, a living proof that instinct and spirit need not be enemies. The wars within end before the wars without can cease. Jung warned that the world hangs by the thin thread of the human psyche. Every act of integration strengthens that thread. The paradox of the final integration is that nothing dramatic remains to do. The work becomes living itself, fully, simply, attentively. Anger still visits, but as teacher, not tyrant. It whispers rather than roars, and its message is clear. Protect what is sacred, but harm nothing. The person who hears this no longer fears their fire. They understand that consciousness was never about extinguishing passion. It was about illuminating it from within. In the deepest silence, Jung's philosophy converges with the mystics he admired. The fire that once burned the ego now fuels awareness. The light it gives is not dazzling but warm, steady, eternal. The self, both human and divine, stands revealed as what it always was, the meeting of heaven and earth, instinct and intellect, flame and form. And in that realization, the story ends as it began, with fire. But this time, the fire no longer hides, no longer hurts. It simply is. It flickers in the eyes of those who have faced themselves and lived to tell the truth. It burns quietly behind every act of courage, every honest no, every compassionate boundary. It is the same fire that forged stars, the same spark that forged you. Jung would say that to master anger is to master life itself, for both are expressions of the same divine energy, the will to exist, to become, to awaken. And when that fire becomes light, you no longer seek peace, you are peace.